Welcome back to the third and final installment of Introducing Ethics. This time we're going to look at what ethics is not. It's not just about facts and opinions. Related to the issue of relativism is the idea that ethics is all about opinion. In teaching ethics, I often find that students hold a view like the following. All statements are either facts or opinions, and all ethical or moral statements are opinions. This seems to resemble a kind of individual relativism, since the ideas of right and wrong, good and bad, come down to opinion. The distinction between fact and opinion is a further claim, however, since it is a way of classifying moral statements. Moral statements are classified as opinion, in contrast to statements of fact. Though this is a widespread view, thanks in part to the Common Core curriculum, I will argue that this distinction is ultimately inaccurate and unhelpful. To make the case that the distinction between fact and opinion is inaccurate and unhelpful, I'm going to use a style of argument called reductio ad absurdum. This style of argument assumes a key premise only to show that assuming it leads to a contradiction. A contradiction is between two statements, both of which cannot be true simultaneously. For example, I am in Ohio and I am not in Ohio is a contradiction. Both can't be true. It's impossible. I'm either in Ohio or I'm not. If an argument reaches a contradiction through a series of discrete and valid logical moves, we know that one of our premises is necessarily false. In this case, I'll show, that is, prove logically, that our initial assumption is necessarily false. If it's correct, we should reject the fact-opinion distinction or attempt to revise it to avoid this very serious problem. I will go on to argue that we should reject it outright. Here's my reductio argument laid out in argument form. Assumption 1. All statements are either facts or opinions. In other words, we can classify all statements or propositions as either statements of fact or statements of opinion. Now some definitions. Definition 1. A statement of fact is provable and true. Definition 2. A statement of opinion is not provable and not true. Definition 3. If a statement is not true, it is false. Premise 2 is about premise 1. Premise 1, in other words, the assumption that all statements are either facts or opinions, is not provable. 3. If facts are provable, then premise 1 is not a fact. 4. If premise 1 is not a fact, then it is an opinion. If premise 1 is an opinion, then it is not provable and not true. Hence, if premise 1 is true, then it is false. This is where we reach our contradiction. Therefore, premise 1 must be necessarily false. Let me say a bit more about how this argument works, step by step. First, premise 1 makes an assumption for the sake of argument. It assumes that all statements are classified according to fact or opinion. Furthermore, it defines the terms carefully. Facts are provable and true, whereas opinions are not. And this harmonizes with what I often observe in the classroom. Because a statement, say, abortion is wrong, is a moral statement, students are quick to classify this as an opinion. There is no way on this view to sort out whether it's true or false because you can't prove that it's true or false. But students tend to do one of two things upon being confronted with moral statements, which I find baffling. Either they classify all opinions as necessarily false, or all opinions as necessarily not provable, and hence regard them as all necessarily true. But this is nonsense, and is ruled out by our definitions. According to our definitions, opinions cannot be true. It follows logically from definition 2 both that opinions are not provable and opinions are not true. If opinions, that is moral statements, are not true, they're false, following definition 3. Premise 2 examines the statement made in premise 1. If it's true that all statements are either classified as statements of fact or statements of opinion, then it must be the case that premise 1, as a statement, is either a fact or an opinion. We know the definitions of what a statement of fact is and what a statement of opinion is, so we should be able to determine whether it's fact or opinion. Let me explain why I say it's not provable. In order to prove a universal statement, those that use the quantifier all, we would have to examine all statements to see whether it was possible to classify them all under the umbrella of either fact or opinion. Since we don't have and couldn't have access to that, we should conclude that we can't prove premise 1. In order to show that a universal statement is false, however, all we have to do is come up with one counterexample, because then it's not the case that all statements fit. We might consider a statement that seems to be both fact and opinion. If such a statement is possible, then the mutually exclusive territory this distinction charts out is inaccurate. What about a statement of opinion that is about a matter of fact? For example, I believe I typed this sentence. You can't observe me typing, you only see the typed words. And because it is a statement of belief, we would think that it is an opinion. But it's either true or false that I, Alex Bearden, typed that sentence. So it's either a fact that I typed it, or a fact that I didn't type it. Because I did type it, then it's true that I typed that sentence. If we can find any instance of a statement that appears to be both a fact and an opinion, then we have a counterexample. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Those who advance this distinction between fact and opinion tend to hold that there are no such counterexamples. The rest of the argument is sufficient to show that assertion 1, in other words our first premise, is deeply problematic and should be rejected. Premise 3 just follows by definition 1. Premise 3 and premise 1 together yield premise 4, that all statements that are not facts are statements of opinion. Premise 5 also follows from 4 and definition 2, and it, all statements are either facts or opinions, must be neither true nor provable. So our very starting assumption is itself an opinion. We can't prove it, and we can't assume it true. Because we can't assume it's true, then it must be false by definition 3. We reach the first conclusion in premise 6. We assume that premise 1 was true, that all statements could be classified as facts or opinions. But if we do this, we see that we should regard premise 1 as an opinion. According to our definitions, particularly definition 2, and the reasoning in premises 1 through 5, we should conclude that premise 1 is false because all opinions are not true, in other words false, by definition. Again, it follows logically from definition 2 that statements of opinion are not true, and hence from definition 3 that opinions are false. So now we have the contradiction. Premise 1 is both true and false, but that's impossible. It either is true or is not true, not both. That means that one of our premises in 1 through 5 is necessarily false because the reasoning results in a contradiction. Therefore, our main conclusion on line 7 is that premise 1 is necessarily false. If it were true, it would necessarily lead to contradiction. If you follow the reasoning, you should reject the claim that all statements are either facts or opinions as necessarily false. It is inaccurate and unhelpful because it leads us to contradiction. More bluntly, it's just a false and meaningless distinction. It tells us nothing about how to helpfully characterize statements, and to thus assess the truth value of statements. In other words, knowing whether a statement is a fact or an opinion does not tell us anything about whether the statement is true or false. Let me offer a way out. The way out is to suggest better definitions of facts and opinions, and to do so without asserting this mutually exclusive territory between them. We need a better way to assess the truth value of statements. A simple classificatory system is fruitless. Instead, we need to think harder and more critically about what makes a statement true or false. Simply calling a statement a fact or opinion does nothing to help us to do this. An opinion is a statement that is uttered or provided without evidence or reason to support it. But opinions are not necessarily false. Opinions can either be true or false. We need to examine the relevant and available evidence and reasons to determine whether it's true or false. So we were wrong in thinking that just because something is an opinion, it's necessarily false or necessarily true. We may not be able to prove whether an opinion is true or false, but we can reason about them, and we'll find some to be true and some to be false. And this holds regardless of whether we can know the truth value of every statement. Now on to facts. A fact does not need to be provable. It either is a fact that God exists or God doesn't exist. It can't be both. That would be a contradiction. But we may not be in a position to prove this, though there are, of course, rational arguments on both sides which claim to offer proof. Likewise, we may not be able to prove whether there is intelligent life or life at all outside of planet Earth, but it either is or is not the case. So facts don't depend on provability. They are true independent of our ability or capacity to prove them. In philosophy, we examine reasons or premises to determine whether we should believe something is true. A mere opinion is unhelpful since it is something asserted without support or evidence. Our task is to see if we can provide reasons or evidence in support of our claims, even if we can't definitively prove them. So we need to go beyond mere opinion and explore whether we can offer rational support for our beliefs. We may disagree, but we do so by offering reasons and evidence. The fact-opinion distinction is misguided and superficial. A moral statement can't simply be dismissed by labeling it opinion. We need to dig deeper to determine whether there is support or evidence for it. To do this, we need to use arguments. That's what philosophy is all about. Ethics is about using arguments to determine what is right or wrong, good or bad, and most importantly, why, offering reason and evidence. So in closing, I hope you'll check the fruitless distinction of fact and opinion at the door and dig deeper in our discussions. Thanks for listening.